The rain had been falling since matins, and by the time the carriage turned into the courtyard of Harrowmere, Prudence Ashcombe had already counted the raindrops on the window twice and lost count both times. She was counting because counting was what a woman did when she did not wish to weep. And weeping, her aunt had told her at breakfast, would swell her face and make an already unfortunate bride look worse than she was. An already unfortunate bride, that had been the phrase. Prudence had folded her napkin very carefully after her aunt said it, and she was folding it still, in her mind, as the wheels ground over wet gravel, and the great house rose before her out of the mist like something too tired to have been built by any one kind. She was 32. She was a large woman, broad through the shoulder and full through the waist, a woman whose gowns had always required more cloth than her cousins, and whose entrances into rooms had always required more courage. She had heard in her time every arrangement of syllables the tongue could summon on the subject of a plump spinster, fat, stout, heavy, comfortable, generous, big. She had learned to let each one pass through her without settling. She had learned, she thought, most things one could learn about being looked at and found insufficient. She had not learned how to be sold to an ancient duke. That was what her uncle had called it, though not in her hearing. The kitchen maid had told her who had it from the footman, who had it from the study door left ajar. Sold. And it was not untrue. Her father, dead these 7 years, had left debts that flowered every spring like some perverse crop, and her uncle, who had taken her in out of charity and reminded her of it at every meal, had at last found the buyer for the last unentailed asset in the house, which was Prudence herself. The Duke of Harrowmere was 71 years old. He had buried 3 wives. He required, said the contract that had crossed her uncle's desk in a hand, so shaky it could scarcely hold a pen, an heir, and had been persuaded by his physician that the last remaining hope of getting one lay in a young, healthy, sturdy woman of good family and no expectations. Sturdy, Prudence had read that word, standing at the study door on the day the letter came, and she had felt it lodge in her like a splinter. One could not fish out sturdy, the word for a horse that could pull a plow on hard ground. And so the carriage had come for her at dawn, and her aunt had kissed her cheek without warmth, and her cousins had wept the way girls weep at the theater when the heroine boards the ship for the colonies. And now here she was, at the top of a wet drive, being handed down by a footman whose eyes she could not quite meet. You must understand, child, that a bride in that century did not choose her hour. She was chosen, and she arrived, and she made her face into the face the room required. Prudence made hers now, and it was a very good face indeed, because she had been practicing it since she was 15. The doors of Harrowmere opened. She had expected mourning colors or guilt turned green with neglect, or the sort of chill that gets into a woman's bones and does not leave. What she found instead was warmth, not showy warmth. A fire in the great hall that had been lit at least since dawn, judging by the depth of the coals. Candles enough, but not one too many. A carpet? Worn but clean. The smell of beeswax and something else. She could not name it first, and then could. Bread. Someone in this house was baking bread on the morning of a wedding, as though the day were ordinary. She noticed all of it. She noticed the servants standing along the wall, not many, 6 or 7, and their livery pressed and their eyes bright, and none of them looked at her as though she were livestock delivered late. One woman, older, in the black of a housekeeper, made her a curtsy that was neither too deep nor too shallow, and said, "Welcome to Harrowmere, Miss Ashcombe. His Grace begs your pardon. He is delayed a quarter hour by his physician." His physician, said Prudence, because it was easier to speak of the physician than of his Grace. He is often delayed by his physician of late. The housekeeper's eyes flicked once to her face, mildly, taking her measure without cruelty. "I am Mrs. Vale." If you will come, we have laid a fire for you in the blue room, and there is tea. You must be cold." "I am not cold," said Prudence, who was very cold. "Then you will indulge me, Miss Ashcombe, for I have been up since 4, and I should like to sit down where the fire is." It was said so pleasantly, and so precisely, on the seam between deference and command, that Prudence laughed. She did not mean to. It came out before she had permission. And she saw Mrs. Vale's mouth twitch just once before it composed itself back into professional stillness, and she thought, "There is at least one person in this house who is not afraid of me, and not disgusted by me, and that is one more than I had at breakfast." She followed her up the great stair, and while she climbed she catalogued, because cataloguing was another thing one did to keep from weeping. The portraits on the wall had been dusted recently. She could see the pale ghost of neglect that had been wiped away. The banister was oak, and the beeswax scent was thickest here. The house was not neglected. The house had been prepared. Someone had gone through it with an eye and a cloth and an intention. She wondered whom. The blue room was blue only in fragments. A coverlet, a curtain tie, a chipped bowl on the mantel. But the fire was proper, and the tea was hot, and the biscuits were freshly baked. And Prudence sat down in the chair set for her, and discovered that her knees had been waiting all morning to give. "You will be brought up when his grace is ready," said Mrs. Vale, "if you find that acceptable. And I shall send Anna up to help you into your gown. You have traveled a long way in a wet carriage. Take the tea before it goes cold." "Mrs. Vale?" "Yes, miss?" Prudence looked at her hands, which had been folded correctly since the previous county. "How ill is he?" There was a pause. It was a pause that told her more than the answer would have. Mrs. Vale set the teapot down and adjusted the handle so it pointed to the fire, which was not necessary at all. "His Grace is a very great gentleman," said the housekeeper, "and it is not my place to speak of his health. But you will find him kind. I have been in this house 41 years, Miss Ashcombe, and he was kind when he was 3, and he is kind now, and there are not so many men of whom that can be said." She left. Prudence sat and looked at the fire, and thought about the word kind, which was not a word anyone had used of her intended in any of the polite fragments she had gathered from her uncle's guests. Old, yes. Ancient, yes. In poor health. In great want of an heir. Not kind, kindness, in her small and rather bruised experience of the world, was not an attribute one advertised in a marriage contract. She took the tea. But it was hot and strong, and she drank it faster than a duchess-elect probably should have. Tra, war, cra. And here is the thing you must understand, because the story cannot go forward until you do. Prudence Ashcombe had come to Harrowmere expecting to bury her future along with the man who was about to marry it. She had come, expecting a wedding night, that would be a duty and a shame. She had made her peace, on the road, with the notion that she was to be a healthy young womb attached to a great old name, and that if she was very careful and very patient, the old man might not last more than a year or 2. And then she might be a widow, with a house. That had been her arithmetic? Done in a wet carriage with her forehead pressed to the cold glass. She had thought it a decent arithmetic. She had not thought it required her heart at all. The gown was ivory. It had been sent ahead and it fit. Someone had had her measurements taken and taken correctly, and the seamstress had not been mean with the cloth. Anna the maid was 17 and gentle, and did not once let her eyes go where the eyes of her aunt's maids had always gone, which was to the seam that had to be let out, and the place where the sleeve caught. Anna fastened the little pearl buttons up her back, with the patience of a girl who had been told to be patient, and Prudence stood in the pier-glass and looked at a large woman in ivory silk, and thought, "At least she looks like she meant to come." There was a knock, Mrs. Vale. His Grace was ready in the chapel. The rector had come. Would Miss Ashcombe be pleased to descend? Miss Ashcombe was pleased. Miss Ashcombe was terrified. Miss Ashcombe went. The chapel of Harrowmere was small and old and cold, and the rector was thin and elderly, and looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that could not decide whether it was pity or approval. The pews were empty but for three: Mrs. Vale, a steward with grey side whiskers, and a woman in dove-grey who might have been 50 and who watched Prudence walk up the aisle with an intensity that would have been rude in anyone less obviously accustomed to being obeyed. And at the altar, leaning on a black cane, was the Duke. Prudence had prepared herself for him. She had spent the whole journey making him in her head. Bent, palsied, wet-lipped, watery-eyed, one of those old men one saw in the corner of drawing-rooms, who spoke about the war before last and asked twice for the same cake. She had prepared herself to be kind to him. She had prepared herself not to flinch. The man at the altar was old. Yes, he was thin. His hand on the cane was mapped with veins the color of ink. His hair was white and thin at the crown. But his back was straight, and his eye, when it lifted to meet hers, was clear and dark and steady, and it was the eye of a man who had noticed her the way one notices a person, and not the way one notices an offering. He inclined his head. "Not deep. Just enough, Miss Ashcombe." "Your Grace. You are wet from the road, I think. I am sorry we could not delay for finer weather." "Well, the rector has another appointment at 4, and my strength is a shorter tenant of the day than it once was." He said it plainly without self-pity. Prudence found her voice and said, equally plainly, "Then let us not keep him." Something moved in his face. Something very small. She could not read it then. Later she would think it was the beginning of what he had already begun to hope she might be. The service was brief. She said what she was to say. He said what he was to say. His voice was low and a little dry, but he did not falter, and when he took her hand to put on the ring, his fingers were cold, but his grip was firm, and the ring, an old ring worn thin at the band, slid onto her finger as though it had been waiting for her particular hand. The rector pronounced them married. The Duke did not kiss her. He lifted her hand instead, in a courtly way that must have been old already when he was a boy, and pressed his lips very briefly to her knuckles, and said, "Duchess." The word landed in her strangely. She had thought she would hear it and feel nothing but the weight of the transaction. She heard it, and felt the fire in the hall, and the bread in the ovens, and the pause when she had asked how ill he was, and the way he had said Miss Ashcombe, as though he already knew what her name would cost her to hear. Duchess. Pot. They dined at a table meant for 20, in a room with candles enough for 6. He sat at the head, she at his right, not at the far end as she had feared. He ate very little, a spoonful of soup, half a piece of bread, 3 bites of fish, and she pretended not to notice, because she had already learned in the space of an hour that Edward, Duke of Harrowmere, would not thank her for noticing what he could not conceal. His name was Edward. She had known it from the contract. She discovered in the course of the dinner that no one in the house called him anything but Your Grace, and that this was not because he required it, but because he had never asked them to stop, and no one had thought to ask if they might. Send. She filed this away without comment. Filing things away without comment was, she was beginning to realize, going to be a great part of her new employment. He asked her about her father. Not her aunt, not her uncle, not the trouble that had put her in the wet carriage. Her father. She had not expected the question, and she nearly cried at it, and she stopped herself by the same mechanism she had used since she was 15, and she told him. She told him that her father had loved books and been ruinous with money, that he had taught her to read Latin at the kitchen table, that he had died believing he had ruined her, and had been more nearly right than he knew. The Duke listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he said, "He taught you Latin?" "He did. I have a library that has not been read in 11 years. My eyes are not what they were, and I have not found a companion whose voice I could bear at length. Perhaps we shall find one another useful in that." She almost laughed. Useful. The old word, the safe word, the word the world had given her, instead of wanted. But he had said it in a tone that was neither cold nor patronizing. He had said it as though offering her a room in his house that had been shut up too long. And she found that she did not want to say no. "Perhaps we shall," she said. He nodded. He looked at his soup and put the spoon down, and looked back at her and said, "There is a matter, Duchess, that we must speak of before this evening ends. I would rather speak of it here, with only the servants who love me for witnesses, than upstairs, where I fear you will be too frightened to hear me." Her hand tightened around her fork. So it was to come now. The wedding night. The heir. The transaction. Laid out. She had known it would come. She had not thought it would come. At the fish course. "I am listening, Your Grace." "Edward," he said. "If you will, I am listening, Edward." He set his hands on the table. They were long hands and thin, and one of them shook very slightly, and he did not try to hide it. "I am 71 years old," he said. "My physician, who is more honest than most, tells me I have perhaps a year. Perhaps less. My heart is failing in the ordinary way of hearts. I have buried 3 wives, Duchess, and I have no children living. I have a nephew, whom I do not trust with a horse, let alone with this house and these people. Do you understand what I am telling you? I understand that you have not much time. I have not much time." And so a marriage was contracted, and so a young woman of good family, and as the letter had it, good health was sought. And so you were brought here, in a wet carriage, on a wet morning, to an old man who is dying. He paused. His eye held hers. "You were told, I imagine, what would be required of you." Prudence's face was, she hoped, the face she had been practicing since she was 15. "I was told an heir was required." "You were told wrongly." The room did not move, the candles did not gutter. And yet something in it turned quietly, the way a page turns in a book one has been reading a long while, without knowing where it was going. "I beg your pardon." And, he lifted his hand, that thin, ink-veined hand, and made a small dismissing gesture, as though brushing away smoke. "I cannot father a child, Duchess. I have not been able to father a child for a decade at least, and I would not put a young woman through the pretense of trying. And I would certainly not put a young woman through the actuality of trying at my age and in my condition. The letter your uncle received was written by my solicitor at my instruction, and it named an heir because to name anything else would have brought every fortune-hunting family in 3 counties into my study within the fortnight. But there is no heir to be got here. There will not be one. I want you to know that before another hour passes in this house—" Prudence sat very still. She had not been prepared, in her wet carriage arithmetic, for this particular sum. "Then," she said, and her voice was steadier than her hands, "what am I here for?" He looked at her a long moment, and then he did a thing she had not seen a man of his rank do in her life. He looked away, and he looked ashamed. "You are here," said Edward, Duke of Heromere, "because I am afraid of my nephew, because there is a girl in this house, my ward, my sister's child, 11 years old, orphaned 2 winters ago, whom he will send to a school in Yorkshire the day after I am buried. and from which she will not come out again as the girl she was. Because I have not the strength any longer to sit up with her at night when she wakes. Because Mrs. Vale is 68, and my steward is 63, and this house will need a mistress who can outlast me, and outlast him, and outlast the lot of them, and see that girl safe to her majority and to a husband of her own choosing. Because I read your letters to your father, he had kept them, and they came to me with his other papers when the debts were sold, and I read a woman who could do it. That is what you are here for. And I have deceived you into coming, and I am not sorry, because I could think of no other way, but I owe you the truth before the door closes behind you. He stopped. He was breathing a little hard. Mrs. Vale at the sideboard had gone extremely still, and Prudence understood without looking that Mrs. Vale had known, and had been waiting for this moment, as one waits at the bedside of a fever. Prudence sat with her hands in her lap, and her heart doing something she did not recognize. She had come here to be a womb. He had brought her here to be a mother. Her name? Said Prudence. Cecily. Cecily what? Cecily. My sister's girl. Where is she now? Upstairs. She would not come down. She has been told there is to be a new duchess, and she is very angry. And she has locked her door, and she has been throwing things, I am given to understand, at the panel. Mrs. Vale. Is that still the case? She has stopped throwing things, Your Grace. She is sitting on the floor by the door now. Anna heard her breathing through the crack. Ah! He lifted his water glass with the hand that shook, and drank, and set it down. You see, Duchess, you were not brought here to be a bride, you were brought here to be a wall. Between that child and my nephew, between this house and its ruin. It is not the office I would wish upon any young woman, and it is the office I have. Prudence was quiet for a long moment. The candles burned, the rain, which had not stopped, tapped at the windows like a creature that wanted in. She thought of the wet carriage arithmetic. She thought of her aunt at breakfast and the word sturdy, and her father teaching her the Latin word for wall, which was murus, and how he had made her decline it 20 times and laughed at her when she got it right. She thought of the bread baking in an ovens on the morning of a wedding, as though the day were ordinary, and of Mrs. Vale climbing 4 flights before dawn to make sure the blue room was warm. She thought of a girl of 11, alone behind a locked door, throwing whatever came to hand at whatever came near. Edward, she said. He waited. I will not enter this house as a lie. If I am to be the wall between that child and your nephew, then the household must know it is what I am and what I chose, not a bride you got by fraud, a duchess you chose because you needed one, and I agreed to be one. And I will not have, Cecily told. I have come to replace her mother, or her aunt, or anyone she has loved. She will be told the truth as she can hold it. Do you agree to that? I agree. I will have the authority you promised in the letter. Over the nursery. Over the household. Over the schoolroom she has not been going to. I will not be a decoration, Edward. I did not come this far in the rain to be a decoration. You will have it, and I want to see the contracts. All of them. I want to know what has been signed, and by whom, and where your nephew's leverage is. I do not bargain, Edward, with half a story. I will not stand as a wall for a house I have not been permitted to see the map of. There was a pause, and then Edward, Duke of Harrowmere, did the second thing she had not seen a man of his rank do in her life. He smiled. It was a small smile, and tired, and worn thin at the edges as the ring on her finger. But it was real, and it changed his face. Mrs. Vale, he said without looking away from her. Fetch the box from my study, all of it, the Duchess would like to read. And Mrs. Vale, who had been in the house 41 years and had seen 4 brides come through the door, made a curtsy that was this time a little deeper than it needed to be, and went. The girl behind the locked door was called Cecily, and she was 11, and she had a wound So specific Prudence did not understand it for a week. She sat outside the door that first night in her ivory gown, because she had not troubled to change. And she brought a candle and a plate of the wedding bread and a book of her father's that she had put in her trunk without knowing why. And she read aloud through the door. Not to Cecily. Simply aloud. The book was Ovid, the Metamorphoses. In the plain, rough Latin her father had loved, and she translated as she went, softly for the door, and for herself. She did not knock, she did not call the child's name. She read the story of a girl who was turned into a laurel tree, because a god would not stop chasing her, and she read the story of a woman who was turned into a spring, because she had wept too long for her son, and she read until her voice was hoarse, and the candle was low, and no sound had come from the other side of the door but breathing. She rose, her knees ached. She was about to leave the plate of bread on the sill when she heard through the wood a small voice say, "You read it wrong." Prudence stood very still. "Which part?" "All of it. You said fugit." He had already fled, it is pluperfect. Prudence looked at the door and felt absurdly, tears prickle in her eyes. "You are quite right. My father would have boxed my ears. My father would have boxed mine. Your father was a scholar. My father was a rector, he is dead. So is mine." There was a long silence behind the door. Then, "Are you the new one?" "I am. How long will you last?" Prudence considered. She considered several answers, and rejected each in turn, because Cecily Marwood was 11, and had thrown things at a panel, and had corrected her Latin through a locked door, and she was not a child to be lied to. "I do not know," said Prudence. "But I will tell you what I know. I know that I am not going to be sent away. I know that no one in this house has the authority to send me away, now, except your uncle. And he will not. I know that when he dies, this house will be mine to keep, and you will be in it, and you will be safe in it, and I will not let anyone put you in a school in Yorkshire, or anywhere else you do not wish to go. That is what I know, Cecily. I know I am here, to be a wall. Do you understand what I mean by that? Behind the door. Breath. Yes, said the small voice, at last. I understand. Good. Then I shall leave the bread on the sill and go to bed, because I have had a long day. And, if you want to unlock the door in the night and take the bread, I shall not know, and if you want to leave the bread, I shall not mind. Good night, Cecily. She waited. There was no answer. She did not require one. But she went to her room, which was not the Duke's. Edward had been perfectly clear about that, in the study, over the contracts. And she took off the ivory gown, and she folded it, and she got into a bed with clean sheets that smelt of lavender. And she lay in the dark and thought, I have been married 4 hours, and I am not what I thought I would be. And neither is he. The wet carriage arithmetic was gone. She would need new arithmetic. She began, in the dark, to draft it. The bread was gone in the morning. The nephew's name was Rupert Marwood, and he arrived, uninvited, on the 3rd day. Prudence had spent the first 2 days learning the house. Not the staterooms, she had walked those with Mrs. Vale in an hour, but the working spine of it, the corridors the servants used, and the pantries and the still-room, and the linen presses and the account books. Edward had put the account books in her hand himself, on the morning after the wedding, in the library, and had said, I am told by my steward that they are in order. I am also told that by my nephew. I would be grateful if you would tell me the truth. She had told him the truth in a day and a half. The accounts were not in order. They were not disastrous, the estate was solvent, the tenants paid, the harvest had been fair. But there were 3 tenancies whose rents had not been recorded for 2 full quarters, and the discrepancy corresponded almost exactly to a series of small, unlabeled disbursements from the household account. And the disbursements had begun 8 months previously, which was the month in which Rupert Marwood had first been given, by his uncle, and against his uncle's better judgment, the courtesy of signing on the estate's behalf while the Duke was ill. She showed Edward. He looked at the columns for a long time. Then he said, in the driest voice she had ever heard him use, "He always did think I could not see the numbers, because I could no longer see the small print. It never occurred to him that a woman might, I am told by my late father," said Prudence, "that a woman may—" "I begin to see," said Edward. "Why, he kept your letters." Rupert Marwood arrived without warning, in a curricle he could not afford, wearing a coat that had cost more than the curricle, and he strode into the great hall with the air of a man who has been walking into it since he was 5 and does not intend to stop for a wedding. He was 38 years old. He was handsome in the way. Certain men remain handsome for as long as their mirrors continue to flatter them, which is to say, his handsomeness was on loan, and he did not know it. He had his uncle's eyes, but not his uncle's stillness. He had heard, of course. He had come to see. Prudence was in the hall when he came in. She had not intended to be. She had been on her way from the still room to the library with a bundle of receipts, and she had stopped because the front doors had opened, and she stood there in a plain gray day gown with her hair pinned simply, and she watched him arrive. He did not at first know her. He looked past her at Mrs. Vale, who had come out with astonishing speed for a woman of 68, and said, "Where is my uncle?" "His Grace is resting, Mr. Marwood." "Wake him?" "His Grace is not to be woken, Mr. Marwood, by his physician's order. His physician is a fool, and his housekeeper forgets herself. Wake him." "That would be difficult," said Prudence, "since I have given the same instruction that his physician gave, and the housekeeper is following it, and the housekeeper does not, in this house, forget herself. I am the Duchess of Harrowmere, Mr. Marwood. Will you take tea in the small drawing-room, or will you leave?" He turned. He saw her properly for the first time. His eyes went, in the small, habitual arc of a man of his kind, from her face to her waist and back, and his mouth curved into a smile so small and so contemptuous that Prudence had known it, in various forms, from the age of 11. "You are the new Duchess," he said. "I am." "Good God!" He said it under his breath, but not much under it. Mrs. Vale behind him did not move a muscle. Anna, on the stairs, did. Prudence smiled. It was the face she had been practicing since she was 15, and it was excellent. "His Grace warned me you might be surprised," she said. "The small drawing-room, then. I shall have tea sent." She turned. She walked without hurry across the hall to the corridor, and she did not look back, and she did not permit her step to quicken until she was out of sight, and even then it did not quicken much, because the receipts under her arm were valuable, and she was not, she told herself firmly, going to let a nephew who could not manage a curricle break her stride. But her hands, when she reached the library, were shaking. She set the receipts down. She pressed her palms flat on the desk. She breathed in and out and in again, and she thought, very clearly, "He called me, good God, as though I were a joke, and the joke will cost him this house, and he does not know that yet, and I shall not tell him." Edward saw him in the small drawing-room. Prudence, at Edward's request, was present. So was Mrs. Vale, at Prudence's request. So was the steward, whose name was Mr. Harrow, and whose grandfather had been steward before him. Rupert did not like the audience. He did not, on the other hand, wish to make an audience of his objection, so he swallowed it. "Uncle," he said, "you did not tell me you were to marry." "I did not," said Edward. "I might have wished you joy." "You might," said Edward. "I did not wish to trouble you for it." The nephew's mouth tightened. He glanced at Prudence, and then at the steward, and then at Mrs. Vale, and then, very briefly, at the door, as though he had begun to understand that he was in a room whose composition had been arranged for him. "May I speak with you alone, uncle?" "I would prefer not, Rupert. My strength is short and my wife is a party to my affairs. Whatever you wish to say, may say before her, uncle." "You may say it, Rupert, or you may not, but you will not say it alone." There was a silence. Rupert Marwood was intelligent enough, at least, to weigh a losing position. He said, "The estate accounts. My signature is on many of them. I should be given the courtesy of being consulted about the household's disposition." "The estate accounts are with the Duchess," said Edward. "She has been reading them. She has found them interesting. She may wish to consult you in due course on certain entries. I imagine you would be glad to explain." Rupert Marwood's face did the thing faces do when the room has become smaller than the man expected. It was very quick. But Prudence, who had spent a lifetime reading faces, because she had spent a lifetime reading rooms, saw it. She saw him decide, then, that she was the enemy. She saw him decide then that she was not merely a joke, but a problem. She saw him begin, in that moment, to plan. She looked at Edward, whose thin hand rested on the arm of the chair, and whose breath was a little too shallow, and whose eyes were closed for just a fraction longer than a blink. And she thought, "I have perhaps a year, perhaps less, and when this man goes, that man will come. The wall would need to be built now. There is a way. An old house becomes a home, and it is neither swift nor dramatic. It is done by the opening of a curtain in a room that has been dark for a decade. It is done by a fire lit in a schoolroom that has not been used since the last governess left. It is done by a plate of bread set on a sill and a book of Ovid read through a door, until the door unlocks itself. Prudence did these things. She did them without announcement. She rose at 6, and she went to bed at 11, and in between she was, as her father had once said of a good housekeeper he had known in his youth, everywhere, at once, and nowhere obtrusively. Cecily unlocked the door on the 4th morning. She did not come out. She merely unlocked it, and Prudence found this out by trying the handle on her way past, on the way to breakfast, and finding it turn, and letting it turn only far enough to know, and then closing it again without going in, because the child had opened a door, not invited a person. On the 7th morning, Cecily came out, in a black frock that was too short for her and too tight through the shoulders. She had grown in her mourning, and no one had noticed. She came down to breakfast and she sat in a chair. 3 seats from Prudence, and she did not speak, and Prudence did not speak, and Mrs. Vale poured chocolate for them both, as though they had done this every morning for a year. Cecily's wound came out in fragments, and Prudence gathered them the way one gathers pins from a carpet. It was not, as Prudence had at first assumed, only the grief of her parents dying. It was a particular thing, a specific thing, and it was this. On the night before her mother died, Cecily had refused to sit with her, because her mother's cough frightened her, and she had gone instead to the nursery, and read a book by candlelight, and her mother had asked for her. And no one had come to fetch Cecily until the sun was up. And Rupert, 3 months later at a family dinner, had said, in the way men of his sort say cruel things while calling them jokes, that Cecily had let her mother die alone because she had preferred her book to her mother's hand. Cecily had not read a book since. Not one. She had unread Latin through a door because Latin was not a book, it was a language. And she had been permitted it as one is permitted breath. But a book, an ordinary book, with a cover and pages and a story, she had not opened in 2 years, because to open one was to be the child who had chosen a book over a dying mother. Prudence learned this in a whisper, on the 12th night, sitting on the floor of Cecily's room, with her back against the bed, and Cecily's back against hers, on the other side of the mattress, so that neither of them had to see the other's face. She did not weep. She thought about it, and did not, because Cecily did not need her tears. Cecily needed her steadiness. "Cecily," she said, "do you know what your uncle keeps in the box?" "He calls his box? His papers? Among his papers? Among his papers? He has a bundle of your mother's letters to him from the last year of her life. He showed them to me. I have read them. Would you like to know what she wrote about you?" A long silence. "Yes." She wrote, I remember the exact line, because it stopped me. She wrote, "My Cecily reads too late by candlelight, and I do not scold her for it, because a child who loves a book has a country to go to, and I would send her to that country every night if I could." Those are her words. I can show you the letter tomorrow if you like. The breathing on the other side of the mattress changed. It became the careful, measured breathing of a child who is not going to cry in front of anyone, no matter what. "I would like to see it," said Cecily. "Then you shall. And Cecily, whatever else you have been told, by whomever, your mother did not die alone because you preferred your book. She died in her own good time, and she had been sending you to your country all her life, and she was glad of it. Do you hear me? I hear you. Then say it back to me. Not tonight. In your own time, when you are ready." Cecily did not say it back that night. She said it back in her own words. 6 weeks later, over a chessboard in the library, with her uncle asleep in the armchair by the fire, and Prudence trying to remember how her father had told her a night moved. She said it back, and she said it flat, and she said it as one delivers a decision. "My mother sent me to my country. She was glad of it. I did not kill her by reading." Prudence looked at her over the chessboard. "No, my dear, you did not." Cecily moved her knight. She had been reading a book on chess for 2 weeks. She was beating Prudence handily. "Check," she said. "Ah, you should have seen it. I did not. Your father would have boxed your ears." "He would," said Prudence, "and I should have deserved it." "Play on." By then it was late October. The fire in the library was properly built, and the curtains were properly drawn, and Edward in the chair breathed the light breath of a man who slept because sleep had come for him and would take him one day without asking. Prudence looked at him, and she felt, not the fear of a stranger's death, but the ache of a friend's coming absence, and she was startled by the ache because she had not known when it had begun. She had not, in 10 weeks of marriage, once been kissed by her husband. She had not been asked to be, nor did she wish it. He had taken her hand, sometimes, in the library. He had once, when she came in from the garden with rain in her hair, laid his coat about her shoulders without a word. He had more than once, in the presence of servants, called her "my wife," in a voice that was not the voice a man uses for a bargain. He had not called her beautiful. That would come. But he had once, on a night when she read aloud to him from her father's Ovid, said, without looking at her, "I did not know a voice could rest a person so." And that, Prudence thought, was near enough to the same thing. Rupert Marwood came back in November, and he came back with a solicitor. The solicitor was a man called Grimsby, thin and neat and courteous, and he presented, in the small drawing-room, a set of papers that he said had been drawn 11 years previously, at a time when his Grace had been in a state of grave illness, and which named Mr. Rupert Marwood as guardian of Miss Cecily Marwood in the event of his Grace's death or incapacity, and further named him as sole trustee of certain properties held in Miss Marwood's name. Edward, in his chair, read the papers with a face that Prudence could not at first read. Then he lifted his eyes to his nephew, and he said very quietly, "I did not sign this, uncle." "You did. 11 years ago, in February. You were unwell, you may not remember." "I remember February 11 years ago perfectly, Rupert. My sister had just died. I was in mourning. I was not incapable of memory. I did not sign this. The signature is yours." The signature, said Edward, resembles mine. He handed the papers to Prudence. She took them to the window where the light was better. She read them slowly. She read them twice. She looked at the signature. She had by then read 3 months of Edward's correspondence. She had read his hand at every stage of the past decade, the firm hand of 40, the still firm hand of 50, the beginning to shake hand of 60, the thin, trembling hand of 70. Edward had never in his life made an E the way this signature made an E. And the paper, when she held it up to the window, had a watermark she recognized. Because it was the watermark of the paper in her own writing desk, and her writing desk had been ordered by Mrs. Vale from the London stationer 3 years previously. "Mr. Grimsby," she said, without turning, "is this paper 11 years old?" There was a small silence behind her. I could not say, "Your Grace." You could, Mr. Grimsby, if you were being honest, because the watermark on this paper is the mark of a firm that did not exist 11 years ago. Its founder set up business 4 years ago, on the retirement of his father. The mark is his. She turned. She had never, in her life, held a room the way she held that one. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not lift. She simply set the papers down on the table between them, and she looked at Rupert Marwood, and she said, "You have forged this. Poorly, take it away, Mr. Grimsby, and do not bring it here again." Rupert's face did what faces do. When they have been counting on a thing, and the thing has come apart in the counting. He rose. "I shall petition the court." "You may petition whomever you wish," said Edward, whose voice was steadier than it had been in a week. "You may petition God. But you will petition without this document, because if you produce it in a court of law, my wife will testify to what she has just told you, and my steward will testify to the watermark, and my solicitor, my real one, Rupert, not this creature, will produce the letters I wrote in February of that year, in my own hand, which I recorded my dispositions. In the event of my death, and in none of them do you appear. Get out of my house." Rupert Marwood got out. Not gracefully, but he got out. The solicitor Grimsby, who was neat and courteous and had, Prudence suspected, been paid rather less than he had been promised, made a small bow at the door and said, "Your Grace, my apologies. I was misinformed." "You were," said Prudence, "and I hope, Mr. Grimsby, that you will be better informed in the future, because the next time I see you in a court of law, I shall not be as generous." He left. The door closed. Edward, in the chair, closed his eyes. Mrs. Vale at the sideboard made a small sound that was not a sob, and mastered it. Prudence stood at the table and looked at the forged paper, and she thought, "I have built the wall. It will hold." Edward opened his eyes, he looked at her a long moment, and he said, in a voice she had never heard him use in her life, "Prudence, come here." She came. He took her hand. He did not lift it to his lips this time. He held it against his chest, over the failing heart, and he looked up at her, and he said, "You are the most beautiful thing that has come into this house in 40 years. She stood very still. She had heard, in her time, every arrangement of syllables the world could summon on the subject of a plump spinster. She had not heard those, Edward, she said. "You will let me say it, please. I have not much time, and I have been a coward about it for 2 months, and I will not be a coward now. You are beautiful, Prudence. Not in the way the world means when it uses the word, but in the way I mean, when I use it, which is the way the word ought to be used, and the way I intend it, will be used in this house from this hour on. Do you understand?" "I understand. And I did not marry you to be a wall, though I told you I did. I married you because I read your letters and I thought, There is a woman I should have liked to know when I was 30, and I am 71 and dying, and I shall have to know her now. Do you understand that as well?" "I understand that as well." "Good," said Edward, and he let go of her hand, and he leaned back in the chair, and he closed his eyes again, and he smiled the small, tired smile that had, over 10 weeks, become the smile she waited for at breakfast. Mrs. Vale at the sideboard was weeping quietly and pretending not to be. Prudence went and stood next to her and put an arm about her shoulders, and did not pretend. Edward, Duke of Harrowmere, lived 7 months more. They were not easy months. His strength went in stages, and each stage cost something. First, the long walks in the garden, then the walks at all, then the stairs, then the library, then everything but the small chair by the window in his own room. But he was not alone in any of them. Prudence read to him every evening. Cecily read to him every morning, in Latin at first, then in English, then in whatever she liked, because she had begun, in the middle of December, to read again. Books with covers, all of them at once, as though she were making up for lost country. Rupert Marwood did not come back. He wrote once a letter of such abject and unconvincing contrition that Prudence read it twice and then put it in the fire in front of Mrs. Vale, who nodded once and said, "Very good, Your Grace." Edward's solicitor, his real one, a Mr. Whitlock of London, who had known him for 30 years, came in January, and again in March, and by the end of March everything had been signed, and every signature had been witnessed, and every provision had been made, and Cecily Marwood was, in the event of her uncle's death, the ward of her aunt by marriage, the Duchess of Harrowmere, and no court in England was going to overturn it. He died in the last week of May. He died in the small chair by the window in the middle of the afternoon, with the curtain open, and the sun on his face and Prudence's hand in his, and Cecily reading Ovid aloud on the floor by his feet. He said at the end, "My dears," and nothing more, and then he was quiet, and then he was gone. Prudence sat with him for a long time. Cecily sat with her. Mrs. Vale came in eventually and did what needed to be done, and Prudence rose and went out into the corridor and stood by the window at the head of the great stair, and looked out at the garden he had loved and had not walked in for 2 months, and she wept. She wept for a while. Then she stopped. Then she went downstairs, because there was a house to be kept, and a child to be raised, and a nephew, somewhere, who might yet think there was a chance, and there was not, and it would be her business to make sure of it. She kept the house. She kept it well. She did not sell the estate. She ran it. Mr. Harrow the steward stayed on, and Mrs. Vale stayed on, and Anna the maid rose in due time to be the housekeeper's assistant, and the tenancies were recorded, and the harvests were fair, and the tenants paid, and the small unlabeled disbursements never began again, because no one was signing on the estate's behalf but the Duchess herself. And the Duchess signed nothing. She had not read 3 times. She sent for a governess for Cecily, a proper one, a Miss Wycliffe from Edinburgh, who was 31, and had a first-class education and no patience for cruelty. And the schoolroom that had not been used since the last governess left was used again, every day, and Cecily grew and read and beat Miss Wycliffe at chess by the following winter, and in due time went to a school she had chosen herself, which was not in Yorkshire, and came home for the holidays, to a house that kept a room ready for her always. Rupert Marwood ran through what remained of his own money in 2 years, and left England for the Continent, where he could be a duke's nephew more cheaply. He never came back. Prudence lived to be 84. She did not marry again. She wore, until the end, on the 3rd finger of her left hand, a thin, worn ring that had been slid onto her hand on a wet October morning by a man who had told her the truth over a fish course, and had held her hand against his failing heart, and told her she was beautiful, and had meant it. Cecily Marwood married in due time a man of her own choosing, a country doctor of no rank and considerable kindness, and named her first daughter Prudence, and her second Edward. Edwarda, in fact, which was a compromise reached in a spirit of some hilarity between her and her aunt, over a chessboard in the library, where the fire was properly built and the curtains were properly drawn. And in the great hall of Harrowmere, on the wall by the door, hung two portraits. Edward, Duke of Harrowmere at 40, in the coat he had worn to his first Parliament, and the Duchess Prudence, at 40, in a plain grey gown, painted by a good country painter, who had not been told to flatter, and had not tried, and who had caught the wide, steady face, and the wide, steady hand on the arm of the chair, the exact expression of a woman who had come to a house in a wet carriage expecting to bury her future, and had stayed instead. Not been chosen, not been rescued. Stayed. As one stays with a person one has come to love, and with a child one has come to keep, and with a house one has come to be the mistress of. She stayed. The bread had been baking on the morning of a wedding, as though the day were ordinary. And in a way it had been, because every day in that house from that morning on was baking bread, and setting fires, and opening curtains, and reading Ovid aloud through doors, and it was ordinary, and it was hers. That was the wedding night surprise, though of course the world outside the door was told a different story, and told it in the salacious whispering way the world tells such things, and Prudence let them think what they liked. She knew what had happened over the fish course. She knew what had happened in the small drawing-room with the forged paper. She knew what had happened by the window, in the last week of May. She knew what she had been promised, and what she had promised in return, and what she had kept. And here is the last thing you must understand, child. The mark a woman makes in this world is not always the mark the world sees. Sometimes she writes her name in frost on a carriage window in a wet October morning, expecting the frost to melt and the name to be gone by afternoon, and instead a man reads it and does not let it melt where it mattered. Prudence Ashcombe wrote her name in frost. Edward, Duke of Harrowmere, read it, and set it into the stone of his house, where it could not melt, and where it did not. And, if you should ever pass through that county, and there is such a county, though I will not tell you which, you may find, in the parish church, a mile from the great house, two stones side by side, one small and old and worn and reading only Edward, and one beside it reading Prudence, his wife, who stayed. And beneath them both, in a hand a child chose for the mason, in Latin because it had been the language of the door that unlocked itself, the words, Manet in aeternum. She remains. Into eternity. She remained. Now, before we go, before I let you back into your own evening, I should like to know what did you feel, listening to this, when Edward told her what he had truly brought her to Harrowmere for? Did you know, at that fish course, that he would love her? Did you know, at that fish,